talking this afternoon with Professor Lawrence Grossberg. Larry is the Morris Davis Distinguished Professor of Communication Studies and Cultural Studies. He also has an adjunct appointment in the Anthropology Department and directs the University Program in Cultural Studies. Professor Grossberg is well known for being one of the people who's actually made popular culture, and more specifically youth culture, a legitimate scholarly area of discourse in the United States. So we're happy to talk with you this afternoon.
Thank you.
So to begin, tell us a little bit about your courses. I mean, what do you teach, and that's fun?
Well, nothing at the moment. I haven't been teaching undergraduates, and it's always more fun to teach undergraduates, I think, because of certain needs and reshaping the graduate program here. But I had taught for a long time a course on the cultural history of rock and roll, and that's fun.
I'll bet.
There are many ways of teaching rock and roll, and I think I was amongst the first back in the late 1970s to offer what you might call a serious course in rock and roll. It was not musicological, and it was not merely a kind of popular history of rock and roll. It was an attempt to get students to think about the way in which music and how popular music, as it changed, how that said something about society and how that was part of social change, youth culture. And so while we would talk about the history of the music, that we would be reading novels and looking at movies and television and reading books about what was going on in the 60s, and I would pose questions like why, when the Beatles first released a record in the United States, it didn't break into the top 100, but then 4 months later, when they released their second record, it zoomed up to number 2 almost immediately. Thinking about the larger cultural and social context, what was going on in America, what was going on amongst youth, and that's always been kind of my interest. And the course, sometimes I would teach it with 20 or 30 students when I wanted to focus on certain moments, or if I wanted to emphasize punk or something. And sometimes I taught it with 700 students.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was quite fun then. Yeah. And it's fun because students are never quite sure what to make of it, and there's always some resistance. Obviously, taking rock too seriously has always been a problem. Whether someone who was older than the students, it was easier when I was 25. Right. As I got older, whether someone older could understand their culture, their music. So it was all right when I talked about the history, but while they wanted me to get to their music, they were very nervous about it. I often had to prove that I was sort of part of it. I knew the music, I had good taste, but I never, it was always a matter of trying to get them to understand that I wasn't trying to teach them what was good or bad popular music. And I used to have fights with rock critics about whether my job was to educate their palate, as it were, so they appreciated better music. Right. I never wanted to do that. What I wanted to do was to get them to think about why they liked the music they did, by understanding it as part of a larger set of social and cultural relationships. So I taught that course, in a variety of ways for 20-something years. I stopped teaching it now. I stopped teaching it for a number of reasons, one of which is, I'm probably too old to have credibility. I can teach a history of rock course, but, I'm too old to have credibility. I mean, I realized that when a couple of students came up and said to me, "Gee, you remind me of my grandfather." And I realized, there's a credibility gap going on here. So it was all right for me to talk about the 60s, but I didn't want them to think I was romanticizing the 60s. Right. And part of the problem is, in order to do this course well, I had to spend a lot of time keeping up with not just the music, but youth culture and the range of styles and other forms of popular culture that intervene. And truth be told, I just eventually reached a point where I said, I don't have the time to do that, or that's probably not true. I don't have the motivation to do it anymore. I don't. I'm not quite so willing to listen to music that I really don't like, and I'm not quite so willing to watch TV that I really find, not my taste.
Right.
Whereas I used to do that even if I didn't like it, because I wanted to understand it. It got to a point where it wasn't the way I wanted to teach. So I'm developing a new course, I'll mention this, to teach undergraduates, which I'm hoping to do next year or the year after as a pilot project, which will be a course on conservatism in contemporary America, and political
interesting.
philosophy. And I want to engage them as someone who's very upfront about being left-wing. I want to engage with the conservative literature and get them to read. I want to get the students who think they're conservative to read what the conservative literature is, because my sense is some of them do, but many of them haven't read it.
Yeah.
But I also want to get students who don't agree with conservatism to read it and to kind of start some dialogues about the political philosophies and discourses and how they enter into popular culture and how this works in reshaping the political culture of America. So that's my teaching for the future.
That's fascinating, and I can tell from the sort of the passion here why your email address was DocRock, and why so many people sought out your classes.
I think it's always been, for me, it's part of what cultural studies is about. And I think it's changing, but certainly when I entered the academy, I think one of the overwhelming feelings I had was that part of what the academy trained you to do as an intellectual was to put aside your passion. And I actually remember it's a great story at the university I taught at, and since I'm not there, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, there was a bit of a brouhaha over my teaching the popular music course when it got very large and successful, and then the Chicago Tribune did a story on it, and there was me on the stage of this gigantic lecture hall kind of bopping around. And the university wasn't very happy about this, and so they tried to stop the course and argue that popular, rock and roll isn't a serious subject for academic. So I had to write this document about why university should teach it, but in terms of the serious cultural importance of popular music, its interest, its economic importance, etc. And I wrote this and handed it to the dean, and they turned around and said, okay, we accept your argument that this course should be taught, but you shouldn't teach it because you love the music too much and you're too passionate about it.
Oh, gee.
Which I took to be a perfect metaphor for not everything, but some of what I thought was wrong about the academy. Fortunately, I was able to make the argument that I would go along with that if they universalized the logic. So if you really loved Shakespeare, you couldn't teach Shakespeare. And if you really loved
physics,
you could only teach the things that you weren't really passionate about. You couldn't love them or hate them. Only the things you felt blasé about could you teach, and it seemed to me that would make for an interesting teaching experience. But yeah, I do believe one should study, teach the things you're passionate about, and the passion is part of why you're doing it. And certainly when you're getting into things like popular music or youth culture, or even today, when you're dealing with popular culture more broadly, or as I'm more and more writing about political culture, it's all about passion these days.
Right.
And unless you can understand the broader ways in which what we in the academy would call affect, passion, emotion, etc., works, which we're not very good at understanding, then you're not going to come up with very interesting analyses, and you're not going to come up with very interesting discussions in class. That was always part of the thing, convincing students that I wasn't going to try to write the emotions and the sexuality and all of the kind of affectiveness in the body of rock and roll out of my class. I was going to try to find ways to talk about it.
This is really interesting, because I think it reflects a larger trend that I've seen in the academy and in research in general to get beyond cognitivism in sort of the post-World War II sort of psychological sense to a more sociologically embodied mind kind of sense of what we are and what we do, and so we have emotions, we have intellect, and we have bodies, and how all those interact in the world. It seems to be more attuned to the kind of certainly the kind of students we find at the undergraduate level, and the way we work in our ordinary lives. So you were certainly ahead of your time on that one.
Well, you know, I think feminists and other scholars would tell us, and reading the history of philosophy tells us that the traditions of Western thought very explicitly put those kinds of questions aside. They did it, feminists point out, by associating emotions in the bodies with feminine and the male with the cognitive, and since that's where being human is located in rationality and enlightenment, this was the object worthy of study, and the rest was to be put aside. What we now know is you can put it aside, but it's still there, and if you want to understand the world, you better find ways of understanding the interactions between semantic and rational forms of engagement with the rest of human existence, the laughter, the boredom, the pleasures, etc., etc. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons we and many commentators on the political scene don't have a very good handle on contemporary politics, is because we still have this dream that it's supposed to be rational, and enlightened discourse, and it isn't. Now, you can pretend it is, you can wish it is, but you have to then engage with the reality of people's lives and the ways in which information and popular culture and texts and discourses all intertwine with people's emotions and experiences and their bodies in the world.
You must be a mind reader, because I was going to ask how the kinds of information resources that people engage in, especially young people today, begin to open that up for us. The internet and social networking software and the kinds of things that people do with cell phones. I've been looking at how that actually influences youth culture and popular culture in general.
Well, I think there are people who are beginning to try. I have to say I haven't seen much that I think is as compelling as I would like it to be, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is one has to be overwhelmed in the attempt to sort of study, let's call it the cultural terrain today. Popular culture, if you want, but it involves more, because the line between information and what we might think of as something other than popular culture, it's hard to draw. It's unclear what isn't included in popular culture anymore. Right. And it is so overwhelming. I mean, part of the reason I think I can't do it anymore is there are just too many places to go simultaneously. Even when I was writing 20 years ago about youth culture, I had to, in one of my books, write about the fact that when I was trying to write about youth culture, someone would always call me up and say, "Did you just see the show on X, or did you just hear the radio program on Y? Because it's crucial for your argument." And of course I hadn't, because I was watching a different channel or listening to a different, that sense of too much information, too many genres, too many choices, for anyone to sort of grasp a whole and say, what are the interrelations? Now, it seems to me, has exploded beyond comprehension. So I mean, I was just looking at figures on television viewing, and there are people out there writing about television as if this was the dominant medium in America. When you look at the numbers, and they're just going down.
Right.
Now this, so are there people watching? Here's a commercial. YouTube. Are there people downloading onto iPods? Are there people? Yes, but there are people watching net programming, which is a whole new version. I mean, the explosion of not just outlets, but forms of cultural information, cultural entertainment, cultural programming, cultural discourse is just enormous. And then I've always made the argument that you can't study an isolated, you can't write about like Bruce Springsteen right? And people used to get angry because when I would write about rock and roll, I would never write about like the meaning of Bruce Springsteen or the significance of X punk, because I always argue you have to look at these things in their relationships to other forms of music, to other forms of culture, to larger social contexts, right? You have to construct the context in which something operates, and of course for different audiences there are different contexts, so you have to be constructing a kind of moving multiple sense of context in order to talk about culture, right? You can't talk about reality TV in isolation, right?
Of reality, yeah.
I mean, you have to talk about it in relation, because people don't just watch reality TV. If they did, it would make our lives easy. But they don't. They watch other things, right? And so it becomes...
And they may even watch them with a laptop or,
Yes,
or a cell phone.
exactly. Now they're doing, they're watching 2 or 3 things, right? And they've got windows on their, multiple windows operating on their computers. So they're watching YouTube here, and they're watching the film they downloaded here, and they're listening to net radio here. Right. So how do you begin to talk about this complexity, and how do you ask the questions? So one of the arguments I've been making recently is not only that the nature, if you will, of the object, of the field of culture is changing, right? So that, that sense of, okay, you watch a TV program, it was never really right, because as people have argued, no one watched a TV program because there were commercials. And you got up and you went to the bathroom and you did. You
might have talked to somebody.
No one does what film theorists do, which is sit down and watch a movie over and over again till you see every reference in the movie. People don't watch that way. So you can describe. It doesn't work to just describe the text and then say, oh, and by the way, here's what audiences do. You have to put it together, right? And then you have to figure out what the questions are to ask. So the object is changing, but moreover, the ways people relate to the object is changing. So one of the second point I've been making increasingly is the questions we've been asking about the media and about popular culture and about music are no longer necessarily the right questions. Because the questions are always a response to what you assume to be what's going on in the context.
Right.
But if the context is changing, then the questions are changing. So a lot of the kind of theories, I think, that have propelled our understanding of media and popular culture, they're not wrong, they're just irrelevant, right? Or at least we have no right to assume they're relevant. So I'll use it personally. I mean, one of the reasons I stopped writing about rock and roll is because I developed, a theory, which I said described something I called, as academics would do, we invent these, I called it the rock formation. And from the 1950s through the 1980s, I tried to describe, rock's place in a larger set of social and cultural relationships of youth culture, where, and it depended upon social realities, because, for example, it depended upon living in a society in which youth was crucially valued, right? For example, right? And therefore, rock culture was in part about the celebration of youth. It also depended upon, for example, an adult society which youth perceived as essentially boring, right? That 50s, 60s, 70s sense of suburbia.
Right.
So, for me, the politics of youth culture in the 60s was less about revolution against capitalism or anything. It was about revolution against the boredom of adult life, right? Right. But then, it seems to me, by the time you get to the 90s, that's changed. It's changed both because rock isn't at the center of kids' lives in the way it was in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s, kids would say, I would give up my brother before I would give up my music, right? Rock and roll saves your life. Now, I realize there are some kids for whom the music is still central. But for a lot of kids, music is merely a part of a larger apparatus that includes film, which we didn't have. There were very few films made for kids. It includes television, which we didn't have. There was no television for kids. And most importantly, it includes video games and computers.
Yes, absolutely.
And music fits into that. So the place of music has changed, and therefore their relationship to the music has changed. So my description of what the music was doing for 30 or 40 years in America, and the theory I developed, I think no longer works. I would have to start over. I would have to re-ask what are the relevant questions? What are the relations? What are the issues that need to be raised? And I'm too old and too tired to start over again. But I think that's generally true about media. You know, media theory emerges in, about 1920s. It begins and goes through the 60s and 70s. We develop a set of tools, a set of theoretical concepts that we use to explain the media. But I'm not sure they work anymore, because what we're talking about as the media has changed completely.
So some of your graduate students must be trying to do the following: take your theory and translate it into today's media. But what I hear you saying is that that's not the right way to do it. You have to actually start from the bottom and actually do the observation and interpretation within that context, and you can't just transfer a theory over.
I actually don't have students who've ever tried to apply my theory, as it were. I have students who've taken it and elaborated it into other contexts, but most of my students, come in and do their own thing, pretty much, within the broad scope of what I call cultural studies, which is a set of kind of assumptions about how you do intellectual work, looking at relations, for example, looking at contexts, right? Instead of looking at objects. So I wouldn't have a student who gives a reading of a film, right, or a reading of punk, but I might have a student who talks about punk in everyday life in a certain context, right? And in that sense, they would be doing cultural studies for me.
Right.
But yes, that's the argument I want to make. In a sense, you can't take for granted that the concepts you have are the concepts you need, right? And that makes life much more difficult. It makes it much more fun. It makes and it's a very different academic approach. Because the academy teaches you, I tell this to my students, when you go for a job interview, the first question you're likely to get asked is, well, what's your theoretical position? Are you a Derridian or Foucauldian? And my answer is, I'm not anything. Tell me what the question is, and I'll tell you where I might begin to say, okay, I might try to use this concept, but it may not work. Right? And so, in fact, one book I wrote, for example, was called "We Got to Get Out of This Place."
Right. Yeah.
It started to be a book about rock and roll, but it ended up. I ran into the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, which was, this Washington housewives group, although very powerful. Tipper Gore was one of the leaders, attacking rock and roll. Not the religious right attacking rock and roll. Right. These were more, Al Gore's wife was one of the members, and it's suddenly what I became interested in was the relationship between rock and roll and the way in which it was being used in political discourses. And so I got into Reaganism and why Reaganism was moving up, as it were, and succeeding in America. And what I began to find, so I entered it and I said, well, okay, I've got a bunch of concepts that I can use to understand Reaganism. And I wrote the first draft of the book, sort of from rock and roll to Reagan. Right. And because the original title was going to be Another Boring Day in Paradise, which is a line from Elvis Costello when he came to America. He said, you're all living in paradise and you're bored. Right? And it ended up being, we got to get out of this place.
From the animals, Eric Burton.
Yeah, exactly. But I wasn't allowed to say that because then I would have had to pay.
Right.
So I couldn't put the quotes on or acknowledge that this is where it was from. But, everyone knows it. So, I started to write the book. I wrote a draft, using a set of categories that I had inherited from political theory, etc. And it was completely boring, and it didn't say anything interesting, and it didn't seem to me to give us a grasp on what it is. So I had to go looking. I had to spend a year and say, well, who else is there that's talking about these kinds of issues, that might help me and discover a whole new set of discourses. So instead of writing using happened to have been Gramsci's theory of hegemony, I ended up having to bring that together with Deleuze. It was very sexy and, very cutting edge at that moment. To bring Deleuze, but not because I was a Deleuzean, but because I thought some of his concepts helped me describe some of what was happening at the intersections between popular music and rock and roll. So why could you have the PMRC attacking rock and roll and then Lee Atwater? Remember Lee Atwater, who was Reagan's political advisor, the first of the right-wing sleaze, sort of. But he was in a rock and roll band, you know, and they put out a horrible sort of rhythm and blues rock and roll album. So, you know, how could you have the right sort of embracing rock and roll even as it's attacking it? Right. So, you know, the questions change as the context changes. I think academics are very reluctant to see that and to accept that, because it makes your life more difficult, but it makes it so much more fun, I think.
Well, that's why I asked the question, because earlier we were talking about the academy and its conservatism, and the notion of being able to transfer a theory is the standard sort of reductionist, rationalist way of thinking about things. And you've, I think, just given an eloquent sort of way of definition for cultural studies that it doesn't do that.
And you've just used another word that sets me off, and it's another way of saying the same thing. The academy is about reduction. Right? I remember I was in a debate once talking about youth and with this psychologist, and we each gave our little opening things, and then we were supposed to comment. And he said to me, "Well, I don't understand what you've just done, because you started with this very complicated and complex picture of youth culture, but what you ended up with was even more complicated and complex. You know, so what have you gained? Where's the explanation? Where's the simplification?
Give me a soundbite.
Where's the reduction? Here's what it's about. It's about X. You know, which of course people do. It's about the economy. It's about capitalism. It's about race. It seems to me human life is always more complicated. It's never about one thing. It's always about lots of different things that then interact and interrelate. And the joy of intellectual work, and it seems to me the value of intellectual work, if you believe as I do that we're supposed to give better understandings of the world so you can change it, is to celebrate the complexity. It's to make order. It's to create ordered chaos out of disordered chaos. But if you deny the chaos, and you just say it's about rationality, it's about cognitive, life, or it's about capitalism, or it's about, well, you haven't got human life then. What you've got is your theoretical discourse, or your political agenda, which says it's about capitalism. Yeah, you can think Bush is all about capitalism and his buddies in the oil industry, but you don't understand Bush or what's happening in America that way, and you certainly aren't going to formulate a very viable strategy in opposition if that's the best story you can tell about what's going on in America. The best novels are always complicated. Right? The simple novels are the ones you read to your 3-year-old.
Exactly.
Right? On the way up to complexity. So how absurd is it that the most complex cognitive people, intellectuals, want to tell the most simple stories, right? And even the best children's stories, think of Dr. Seuss, are always more complicated than the stories academics tell. It's quite ironic in there.
That's really fascinating. We could certainly go on. I'm sure I was interested in how you look at politics through popular culture, and can you separate the sort of the political reality from is that the lens through which you do your work, your knowledge creation, your interpretations of the world?
This may not answer your question because I may not be understanding it, but I think what I'm always interested in describing is a context of social reality.
Okay.
That context of social reality is simultaneously economic, political, cultural, and social. You can't describe any one. This is the problem with disciplines, and this is the problem with why I'm a great champion and why cultural studies is about being interdisciplinary. It doesn't deny that there are values in the disciplines, but it wants to say, really, the interesting analyses, the interesting stories, the interesting understandings that you're going to develop are when you bring the disciplines together in such a way that you transform the disciplines. I mean, I'm actually working on a book on economics now, right? And I want to ask the question.
That's scary.
What happens to economics if you recognize a number of things? One is, economists create a false object, as do all the disciplines. They call it economics, and they divorce it from political, psychological, cultural, right? Just say, let's have this entity. Now, there are some economists who would try not to do that, but then they might open it up to neurophysiology or psychology. But for the most part, just as political science tends to treat the state as an object, and literary critics tend to treat literature as an object, right? That's what disciplines do, right? But I want to say, well, what if you see that economics is intimately interconnected, inseparable from all these other elements? And moreover, what if you understand that economics is a discourse, it's a way of speaking. And ways of speaking, we know, help to construct the world. Right? That's partly what makes us human, economics the economy doesn't exist apart from the ways we talk about the economy. Right? And the ways we construct and represent and think about and experience the economy. So it's a cultural object as much as it is a non-cultural object. I don't want to say it's only cultural, but I do want to say it is cultural in part. So what happens if you think of the economy now as necessarily interrelated to political, social, economic, psychological, affective, cultural issues? Now also, what if you recognize that the economy is in part necessarily cultural? Now what happens if, and this I think that's a kind of universal, and by the way, I think I can argue that Adam Smith understood that, right? And that the current reading, and I think, Hayek and some other really brilliant thinkers in economics understood that, right? And the current readings of Smith and Hayek and others, they try very hard to erase that recognition. But now, I think a more recent development, and one of the reasons I'm quite interested in it, is what happens when economics enters into the domain of popular culture.
The invisible hand starts to move?
Well, no, the invisible hand becomes an object in popular culture. It becomes an object on video games. So you get these kind of video games where you construct an amusement park. And you have to make choices, the Sims games, where you are constructing economic systems. Right. It becomes part of it when that's one chapter. Another chapter is when you're teaching economics in K through 12. I mean, I just bought $1,000 worth of curriculum that's out there. I don't know, do parents realize that in kindergarten their kids have curricula in economics? What are we teaching kindergarten kids through high school? They're on DVDs, there are books, there are exercises. We have parents are worrying about what they're learning in school. Now,
They're not their 401k plans.
Well, yes, but they are. I mean, and it's not just, obviously, when I say this to my colleagues, they say, oh, well, they're teaching capitalism. Well, yes, of course they're teaching capitalism and not teaching socialism. But, there's much more to be said. How are they teaching it? What are they teaching it? How do they see economics integrated into everyday lives, etc.? Or think about, Greenspan. Greenspan's an interesting phenomenon. Here's a man in the most boring of profession, a banker, right? Who's ever made a sexy hero out of a banker? But Greenspan became this national popular icon, right? What is that about? What happens when economics enters into popular culture? Or Reaganomics, I'm thinking of writing a chapter on the way in which the news has covered Reaganomics. Or supply side. You can walk down the street and hear people refer to supply side.
We have little goodies, but if you want coffee, you'll have to get that.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
A little interruption. Sorry. The realities of everyday life. These are, it seems to me, the inseparability, of political, economic, cultural, popular culture, and these are the kind of issues. Now, am I still a media scholar? Yes, because I think to be a media scholar is to study the context of life. Only my way in is through the media and popular culture. Someone else's way in is through economics. Someone else's way is through voting behavior. But if you're doing it well, it seems to me we're all studying the same thing, which is the context of everyday life somewhere at some time. You know, I'm interested in the contemporary moment.
Right.
You know, you could be interested in 20 years ago or interested in 300 years ago. But if you're trying to do it well, you know, you can't separate out a slice of human life and treat it as if it were sufficient in and of itself.
Wow, that's. I think I want to excerpt that last little piece. I think it says a lot about what we do in universities and what we do as scholars. So.
Can I give you one more excerpt? Cause
absolutely.
Because it's one of the things I always pisses me off about academics as well, is you also, I mean, one of the mistakes it seems to me that we often make is to not think carefully about what's old and what's new. I'm saying that especially in the context of thinking about new technology and information. Right? We tend to make an assumptions about, you know, and I made one a moment ago by saying, you know, I'm overwhelmed by the amount and diversity of popular culture. But, you know, I have a feeling if I would have asked my grandparents in 1940, they would have said the same thing. Right?
Exactly.
You know, all this discourse, all these people who say, well, people used to have a sense of identity and now it's fragmented. I want to say they probably weren't so stable and unified then, and they're probably not so fragmented now. It probably wasn't so simple then, and it's probably not so much more complicated then.
Right.
We have to recognize it's always been complicated, and the problem of what's new and what's old is quite significant. One of my old professors, in fact, one of my two mentors, wonderful scholar named James Carey, who wrote about media and culture, has this great article in which he argued and demonstrated that every time a new medium is introduced, he starts with the railroad and the telegraph.
Right.
And he shows that every time, then the radio, television, actually comic books are in there, the same thing happens. There's one group of people who say it's the end of the world, capitalism is going to occupy, it's going to colonize the mind, you know, it's the opportunity finally for the kind of ultimate biofascism, you know, and the other people who say it's going to save the world, it's going to bring democracy. And you see the exact same thing happening with digital technology now, the exact same, instead of saying, well, you know, it's going to have its effects, it's going to produce changes. It's not quite the same as previous ones, but it's not all that different. I can remember, you know, when I was in grade school in New York City, television, of course, was relatively new, and you know, as it got smaller, and New York City made this enormous multi-million-dollar investment to buy televisions for every classroom in the city, on the argument that television was going to revolutionize education, democratize it, bring, Well, did television change culture? Yes. Did it change education? A bit. But certainly, you know, and I have the same fear, you know, the universities have told us we have to have all our students have to bring their laptops to class. No one knows what to do with the laptops in class.
They check their email.
Yes, exactly. They go online and watch YouTube, actually. Now, maybe they'll watch educational YouTube. But you know, this sense of rather than sort of recognizing the complexity. So yes, there are things that change, but they change in the context of a much more complicated totality, and therefore their effects are always mitigated by what remains the same, and by other things that are changing and remaining the same. You know, that's a kind of different way of beginning to approach the challenges or the promises that new technologies. I mean, new technologies are changing music enormously.
Right.
But of course, music also remains quite the same. You know, and you know what new technology does with new computers. You know, it's a continuation of the imagination of Schoenberg or of
George Harrison.
George Harrison, you know, or some of the early Beatles attempts, or some of the early hip hop. You know, African
Right.
Bombado. Or, I mean,
Yeah.
they're changed, but they're not so radical. Does it democratize music? Yes, but not as much as we like to dream, right? Just as cassette tapes democratize music a bit, just as records democratize music a bit. You know, when the record was first, phonograph was first released, I used to give my students this great essay by John Philip Sousa,
Oh, wow.
in which
Yeah.
he said that the phonograph was going to be the death of music.
Oh,
Right?
really? Yeah.
And in that wonderful, expansive hysteria that only cultural workers can have, and the death of the family, and because the death of the family, the death of democracy, and therefore the death of America, right? All because of this phonograph. Because presumably you wouldn't be sitting around as a family playing the piano. Although, of course, how many families sat around playing the piano to begin with is a bit of an elusive question, you know?
Right.
But that kind of hyperbolic sense, either of pessimism or optimism, which seems to me to depend upon not starting with the assumption of complexity and always kind of opting for the reduction. It's all about the technology. Digitalization is going to change the world. It is going to change the world, but not in any of the ways that we think it is, probably, right? That's my other.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Look forward to reading the book
Great
on
project.
economics.
Hopefully it's more fun than a boring lecture.
Absolutely, this is great. Do you know the book, The Victorian Internet? It's a New York Times columnist did this. It studies the phonograph or the telegraph, and he doesn't even mention the internet inside, but he just gives all these cases where you have to, you know, people got married on the telegraph.
Sure,
There was
sure.
this whole exactly what you were talking
You
about.
know, I mean, the telegraph enabled the stock market. You know, did anyone predict that the telegraph would enable the stock market?
People
No.
cornered the market on gutta percha, this rubber stuff that for the undersea cables, and they made fortune. I mean, it's all
It's
the
like
things.
people, you know, it's like many of my colleagues who argue that, capitalism is commodifying culture. You know, what do they think Leonardo was about? I mean, you know, it was a different form of commodification, but, you know, where in the world
You
for
could have a
600
little bit of a
years
patron there.
have you not had culture being part of a market and culture being produced for the market? You know, again, I mean, capitalism isn't new.
Right.
You know, anyway, I can go on for this.